Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the frost protection webinar. We're speaking about springtime frosts, of course, and what practices and protection methods are available to you if and when the need arises. Coming out of the polar vortex and the damage we experienced last year, it is timely to be speaking about this topic. Frosts do not only happen in the springtime, of course, they can also happen in the fall. So again, keep these strategies in mind as we approach the upcoming season. Here we go. Okay, so what are we speaking about today? Where are we now? So to start, in terms of phenology and the time of year, we're at the very end of deacclimation. So what are we seeing at the moment? What should we be prepared for? We'll also go into discussing the differences between frost and freeze events and the types of frost that we encounter. Also, we'll have and the impact that they will have and the methods of protection that we'll use and the timing of those practices. We'll discuss passive protection, so things that we can do prior to the event of the frost, way back at the establishing the vineyard, and active protection. So once the vineyard is established, what can we do at the time of the frost, so days and hours beforehand? Once we evaluate and understand these options, we'll speak about things to keep in mind when establishing the frost protection strategy. So to finish, we'll set out some key points for you from today's webinar, some takeaways, mostly to think about if and how these options make sense for your vineyard site. All right, so where are we now? Again, depending on your site, but overall, we're at the tail end of deacclimation. So what does this mean? The vine is coming out of dormancy. The sap inside the plant is starting to flow. We're starting to see bleeding, and depending on your site and variety, we'll see some budding as well. The picture here illustrates a south-facing slope in a vineyard and the two hybrid varieties at varying speeds of budding. So remember that hybrids deacclimate faster than vinifera and will bud earlier than vinifera as well. So this may cause some risk in terms of early season susceptibility to frost. And so paying attention to the weather and temperatures is critical at this time of year. Okay. So speaking of critical temperatures, we're looking at the dormant bud stage, the dormant swollen bud, bud burst, one leaf, and then two leaves unfolded. Critical temperatures are defined as the temperature at which the buds will withstand temperatures below zero for 30 minutes or less. Many factors affect the temperature at which the damage occurs, including cultivar, stage of phenology, of the bud, surface moisture, and pre-frost environmental conditions. Also remembering that grape cultivars vary in date of bud burst by up to 2 weeks. So there are differences between varieties in susceptibility and resistance that are not explained by development stage differences alone. And so at the same stage of growth, what we're looking at, and the same temperature, there may be differences in damage. So what does this mean in practical terms? Both the growth stage and critical temperature differences should be considered with regard to your cultivar choice when it comes down to being practical and practical implementation. The growth stage, the graph also shows at which stage and temperature the vine is vulnerable to frost. So the first thing I would notice, for example, on this graph is that the dormant and swollen bud is more cold resistant than, say, the vine which is at 1 to 2 leaves unfolded. While still dormant, or even at the swollen bud stage, the vine is still a little bit more protected. And so once the leaves begin to appear, there's more points on the leaf itself where water can cling to and create ice crystals in a cold event. So the type of frost event and the plant development stage will determine if and how much frost damage does occur. Kevin, do you want to jump in? How are we doing?
I guess the big thing to be aware of is that probably what we're looking at in terms of saying this is a critical temperature, it also is referring to the growing point within those leaves and within that bud. We can handle some superficial leaf injury, but if the growing point or the meristem is damaged, and these are generalized temperatures that most people look at, that's all of our concerns. I can handle a little bit of browning on the margins of leaves as they go, but if I get into that growing point, then it changes the dynamics of that particular shoot. And if it's severe enough and a primary is damaged, you will find about a 7 to 10 day lag phase, and then secondary buds are more likely to appear. And this is very true for hybrids.
Okay, so speaking of yeah, and jumping into the next slide, of course. So we've got frost versus freeze. What is the difference? By understanding the differences between frosts and freezes, we can prepare for those events accordingly. And so also use preventative methods best suited to the site and weather conditions that we experience. So with frosts, we mean the air temperature at 0 degrees Celsius or below. Our main concern in a frost event is when the vine is actively growing. Remembering that spring is not only a time when frost occurs, fall is also a time of variable weather and unexpected temperature drops as well. With the freeze, when water inside the plant freezes is what we're looking at, and the damage the vine's vascular system, which leads to long-term vine damage or even death. So in the wine industry, we speak about winter freeze and spring frost events. The formation of the ice crystals can either be intercellular, so the space intracellular, so the space between the cells, or intracellular within the cell itself. So during spring frosts, injury is mainly intracellular. So spaces between the cells are freezing and those ice crystals are expanding and then causing damage. So it's the ice formation itself inside the plant tissue rather than the low temperatures that cause the damage. So as ice spreads, it also causes the damage to the plant as well. I don't want to oversimplify this, of course. So if you do have any questions, let us know as well. Okay, so why is springtime, speaking about all of this, why is springtime so crucial? And I'm thinking you're probably getting some idea of what the problems might come up. The growing buds have a high water content, which makes them susceptible to the formation of ice. At freezing temperatures, air temperature between -2 and -3 can permanently damage developing buds and leaves. The vine in early spring growth is especially susceptible to frost injury because the sap is starting to flow through the plant, deacclimation is slowly occurring, we start seeing leaves beginning to appear. And each of these leaves have little edges, as Kevin mentioned, that accumulates water, and the plant is vulnerable if the water starts to freeze. As the vine goes through the early stage of season development, it becomes more vulnerable to adverse weather conditions, of course, which makes our vineyard practices all the more important. Okay. So 2 types of frost that we're going to be talking about today, radiative and advective frosts. So a radiative frost is the most common type that we see in many growing regions. In these circumstances, we do actually have options we can use to protect the vines from damage. So radiative frosts occur when the sky is clear, when there's little to no wind, and they occur because of heat loss. So vines will radiate and soil will radiate the heat and lose the heat to the atmosphere. They're often associated with temperature inversions and occur when the temperature increases a temperature inversion occurs when the air temperature increases as elevation increases. So a weak inversion occurs when the temperature above is slightly warmer than the temperature below near the surface. And a strong inversion is observed when temperatures increases with elevation. So active frost protection methods are more effective during radiative frosts compared to advective ones. So advective frosts are typically associated with movement of weather front into an area. So cold and dry air replaces the warmer air that is present before the weather change. So as we see here in the graph, the vines and the soils are radiating heat, and the wind is literally pushing all of that away. So it can happen during the day and night. And basically, because of this consistent wind that is passing, there's very, very little protection that we can do to actually mitigate this problem. And advective frost is associated with moderate to strong winds, no temperature inversion, cloudy nights, low humidity. And so because of this, obviously, the effectiveness of active frost protection is quite limited. Okay. So passive protection strategies. I've put a couple of pictures here. The slope on this vineyard is quite dramatic. So obviously we won't be seeing this in Nova Scotia. However, I've put it up just so that we can kind of get an idea of what we're kind of talking about. So now that we understand the different types of frost events, how do we respond to them? There's a passive and an active method, of course. Passive practices are more preventative and worth considering at the time of vineyard establishment. So they do not modify the vineyard climate in a sense, and they do not typically require energy to be put into the system. So no wind machines, no heaters, that sort of thing. It's literally what we're working with nature. So what we can do about this is site selection, of course, cultivar selection, and cultural practices. The idea is to prevent damage as much as possible. And we're basically trying to put the plant out of harm's way as much as possible to make it less susceptible to cold injury. Remember that healthier plants going into an adverse cold event have a better chance of coming out with less damage. So strategies prior to planting. We talk about site selection, sloped vineyards, remembering that cold air sinks, of course, and pools in low-lying areas. Generally speaking, depending on how deep the slope is, at the top of the slope and at the bottom of the slope is where the vine is a little bit more at risk. In the middle of the slope, because you do have some protection, it'll be a little bit less, generally more protected, so less damage. So we are also talking about, minimizing blockages. So no physical barriers, trees, roads, buildings, all of these things can trap the cold into an area as well. So making sure that these barriers, if we can't get rid of them completely, have a drainage pocket. So think of your bathtub and releasing the water out of the bathtub. Vineyards near bodies of water. So water obviously has a moderating effect, radiates the heat back onto the vines. And so water is generally a good idea. So aspect, which way is your vineyard facing? So is it south slope? On the south facing slope, we'll have more sunshine exposure. So just like we saw with those buds, it's the same sort of thing. They will bud earlier maybe, which kind of causes some risky situations. But however, at the same time, you have more of a protection against cold weather as well. So which varieties are we growing? Cultivar selection for certain sites is much more important at this point. So coordinate your cultivar selection with your location, with frost risk, to prevent damage as much as possible. How to manage your barriers. So it depends on the location and the vines relative to those locations and cold air pooling. So barriers can be either installed or taken away to promote airflow and reduce the pooling of cold air. During radiation frosts, the denser cold air will flow towards the area of lower elevation and will pool in contact with the barrier. So vegetation, buildings, fences, hillsides, as the cold air accumulates in these areas, the frost conditions will intensify. And so for these reasons, understanding your airflow and the additional removal of barriers can be helpful in reducing the severity of frost events. Why is it important to know this? Because then you can select a method that is suitable for your site and the frost conditions that you're experiencing. Okay. So for your cultivar selection, so here is a graph or a picture that illustrates early budding versus late budding cultivars. So keeping in mind that a grapevine cultivar can vary in average of bud break by up to 2 weeks. So to avoid the risk of injury, plant cultivars with early bud break in the vineyard should be located in the sections of the vineyard with the lowest frost risk. Something to remember also, hybrids may be cold hardy, but they are also acclimate and deacclimate faster than vinifera. So understanding your variety, the phenological cycle, and the time it takes between one stage to the next will help you anticipate and mitigate risks depending on the site and variety growing there. So as Dr. Kevin Kerr also mentioned, there we have bud fruitfulness as well is different in hybrids and vinifera. So your secondary buds, if the primaries are damaged in hybrids, tend to be more fruitful than the vinifera ones. So if the loss is encountered, it may be much lower than the vinifera. And so this may also be a consideration to evaluate when replanting. So sustainability in your vineyard also means beyond just sustainability in your vines, but also a certain way also relates back to profitability as well. And this table here illustrates the varieties, of course, but they are in no way specific to a certain site or an area specific in Nova Scotia as well. So that's something to keep in mind. So it always really comes down to your own site.
I'm just going to jump in. This is not a hard and fast diagram showing early bud break. In speaking with Dr. Harrison Wright, his comments are that he's surprised in kind of the listing of how they list from late bud break to early bud break. This particular graph or diagram and information came from Michigan and central US in terms of the cultivar selections, and they were put in there. So what is really useful for any person to do is keep records at your own site every year of which varieties seem to bud first, which bud second, and around the dates that they occur over a number of years. And by recording this, you're going to also be able to establish the risk factor for particular cultivars at your location. So it follows the old rule of thumb that I was taught many, many years ago. The first grapes you harvest in the fall are often the first grapes that start to grow in the spring. And the analogy was early to bed, early to rise. So that's why it kind of comes in that Foch being picked early has a tendency to have an earlier bud break than something such as, let's say, Cabernet Franc or even La Cresson, which is picked a little bit later. It breaks bud a bit later. Now, and there is no correlation between winter hardiness and frost tolerance. Actively growing tissue, regardless of cultivar, is susceptible to frost injury. So cold hardiness is a whole other creature. Sorry.
Nope, no worries. Okay. Actually, yes. So I was just going to mention, so it's advisable to keep your records. Look at your weather stations, access the perennial farm tool stations, pay attention to your weather patterns. After the polar vortex event that we just had, it's a good idea to reevaluate what works best for your site. So next one is your middle row management. So cover crops can create some roughness that can slow the air movement. However, it is not advisable for people to get rid of their cover crops completely due to erosion concerns and also adding nutrients back into your soil. So instead, mow your cover crops down to 5 centimeters or less throughout the season instead. And so this will actually keep everything kind of going much, much better. Cover crop will protect the soil from erosion. The soil is also then available to absorb the heat during the day and radiate it back at night as well. And your cover crop management can be combined with other methods for increased protection.
We'll toss one thing in. You don't have to keep the cover crops short the entire season. What you want to do is think about potentially, it's a lot of energy in that to keep them that short, repetitive trips. If you have an upcoming frost coming and you've got at least 4 or 5 days notice, then go in and mow them down very shortly. But otherwise, just don't let them get too tall and left unmanaged going into a potential frost event. After that, you can manage them as you normally would throughout the remainder of the season. The same thing relative to a fall frost, except you have a high canopy situation, lots of leaf area and everything else, which is going to really restrict airflow. So, but that's the key one for keeping your cover crop. If you can get in a few days before forecast frost in your most risk-prone areas, I don't think anybody can mow their entire vineyard all in a day. A lot of people, it takes longer than that. So when you do it, focus on highest need or highest risk areas first, and then go from there.
Okay. So now we're jumping into active frost protection methods. They're applied just before or during a frost event to prevent tissue damage by either preventing the loss of heat or by providing additional protection to the growing tissue. They're strategies that modify the microclimate in your vineyards. So methods that you use will depend heavily on your site and your budget, of course. This will mean the size of your vineyard. So some equipment is better suited to large scale sites. Is your site level? Is it flat or is it on a slope? Will also dictate what you will be using. The costs associated with running the protection program. So this includes installation, electricity, propane, everything that you're using to actually run this. Understanding of how these frost protection methods work, because many cannot be used in certain weather conditions. Wind may actually damage the equipment itself in the case of wind machines, for example, or air pollution in the case of heaters. So remember that first and most effective method, of course, is to avoid sites that are repeatedly prone to spring frosts. But that's before you're choosing your sites. After is a whole different story.
And it's important to remember, wind machines mix air. They don't blow cold air away. A lot of people have this thought that it's going to push the cold air out of the way. It doesn't. It actually draws warmer air from an inversion layer and mixes it with the colder air. It's kind of like adding a little bit of warm water to cold water to try and just bring the temperature up. And your target is strictly to get it just above freezing. It's not like you have to get it 5 or 6 or 7 degrees above zero. If you can get it to 0.5 degrees Celsius as your mixed temperature, you won't get frost. So a lot of people get caught thinking about that. And if you know the strength of your inversion layer, the ability to change the temperature is only 1/2 the amount of the inversion. So if the ground was at -2 and your upper area is at +6, you mix the two together, the best you can get to is going to be around +1 Celsius. That's fine, as long as it's above freezing. That's your key. But don't think you're going to get it up to 4 or 5 degrees C at ground level. It just doesn't work that way.
So there we go. They work by mixing the air, of course. They're best suited to flat, evenly shaped vineyards. They require no water. Can be powered through a variety of means. So propane, natural gas, diesel, electric. They're generally quite loud as well. So should be considered in vineyards with nearby residences, and generally provide, obviously, as we just mentioned, good protection. So they can, and again, the protection that is produced obviously depends on the strength of the inversion layer as well. The strength of the wind machines varies by the size. So you're also having different size machines as well, and they can protect between 5 and 15 acres. So again, it really depends on your site, what you're using. You've got stationary and mobile configurations as well. They're programmed to be turned on and off automatically when the critical temperatures are reached. And the top priority, of course, is to watch the wind speed and the temperature in order to power the machines and at the right time, and also avoid damage to the equipment. So winds over 10 kilometers an hour will actually damage the machines itself. So, and as we've also kind of mentioned indirectly, do not use them in advective frost situations. You'll only be pushing cold air. So how much are they to run? They run about $50,000 to purchase, and between $100 and $125 an hour to run as well.
One added thing about wind machines, you have to run them past daybreak for roughly an hour. What happens is the coldest temperature you're likely to experience is going to be in the 30 minutes prior to daybreak. If you turn the machines off too early in the morning, you can wind up with frost settling back in. So it was one that we learned doing a lot of research on the machines. Often people will hear the machines run till an hour to an hour and a half past daybreak, and then they know that the air temperature is above zero, and there's no longer any threat of frost. So you have to start them in advance of thinking of frost. In most places, they're 15 to 30 minutes before you're likely to reach zero if you're going to use a wind machine. And similarly, you're going to run them for about an hour to an hour and a half after daybreak. No longer than that, because the ambient air temperature is high. So there's kind of things that the wind machine people know a lot about. And that's a couple of the things, as I say, we've learned the hard way if you start them far too early or turn them off too early type of things.
Okay, so supplemental heat sources. This is something that, depending on where you live, there's either use them quite a bit or not at all. So here we're talking about heaters, smudge pots, and burning materials. So smudge pots, not so much, but heaters and possibly burning. So they work best with temperature inversions because if there's no inversion layer, the air will be too hot, it'll rise, and the warm circulation pattern will not form. So heaters are not commonly used as a sole source of protection because they require large amounts of fuel to run. They're labor intensive to light and to keep going. Each heater generally covers only a small portion of an acre as well. So you have to have many, many of them to actually reach the desired effect. They can be used in combination with machines to provide additional degrees of protection. How to operate. The heaters must be turned on before the critical temperatures are reached. It takes time to light. There are multiple heaters. Lighting must start early enough to allow all the heaters to be lit before the critical temperature is reached. A word of caution, if you are using the heaters and produce too much heat, they may inadvertently puncture the inversion layer and limit the effectiveness as well. Have they been found effective? Burning bales of hay or straw and other products have not been proven effective in Canada. The concept of burning is not to warm the temperature, but to create a dense cloud layer of smoke to trap the warmth near the ground if it's present. It's not to warm the air. So just make sure that, and with Nova Scotia and the potential for wildfire risk, that's also problematic as well. Okay, so is it efficient and cost effective? It is always important to remember that we can work against frost only to a certain degree. So in a radiative frost event, we have an opportunity to mitigate, especially in a small area. In an advective, we will have very little effect on it. So always to keep in mind, are these methods appropriate for my site and my situation? Maintain your ground cover. Are there benefits to it? Is it cost effective? How can I build it into my pre-existing practices? So as we talked about before, mow it just before the frost event if it's coming, just so that way you are not obviously going out and multiple times. Figure out how it works in your plan and go from there. With wind machines, is it large scale situation? In a large scale situation, possibly. Do I have the means to operate it? Is it suited? Is my site suited to it as well? Over the row irrigation. Am I set up for this? How much water and power is required? What are the implications? Do I understand how it works? When to stop, when to start? All of these different things. And your chemical sprays. There are numerous methods and not all are effective to the degree that is required. And also there's also not enough data to support the claims of some of these products. At the end of the day, going into frost with a healthy vine or a healthier plant, one has a better chance of coming out with it healthier as well. This is why pre-planning and vine health and vine balance is so important as well. So what makes a good frost protection strategy? Most frost protection methods will not protect against, all types of severities of frost. But having an idea of conditions that occur most frequently in your vineyard, one can better select a frost protection method to use. So collect your data on site from weather stations. They can be used to determine what type of frosts are occurring, how frequently, the duration, and also then dictating the type of frost protection system that you are using and that will be effective and where to apply those frost protection methods. Weather stations can also be used per frost event to determine when and how long protection is required, how long your protection is required. Managing frost protection based on your site data rather than regional weather forecasts. Resources can be used more effectively and they can be used more specifically to your site. A site map outlining areas of varying conditions, elevations, temperature extremes, timing of bud break, historical frost protection methods, all of those, all of that data is used for, and you can use it for making a great planning tool essentially. So again, weather data, topographic information, personal observations from past conditions, your vine management records, vine age, previous damage, all of those things are very, very important when you're planning your strategies and combining all of these things to actually see what works best for you. So again, it must be economically sound for you. It has to make sense to your budget. You have to consider your profits, your losses, what makes everything that kind of comes together so that you can actually plan this a lot better. And then also thinking about what you can do with what you already have. How can I implement these things today to make a difference when the next frost event comes around? And obviously using all of this data that you can access through your weather stations, at least, will help you plan for the future as well. Some key takeaways. So what are we thinking about before and after planning? So as we've reiterated, be aware of your vineyard site and its limitations. Pick the right spot to plant each cultivar. The growth cycle of each cultivar and your location are very, very important. And especially now when you have a chance to kind of look at what's happened, figure out what you want to do in the future. How can you better protect now that we kind of know what's going to happen in your, especially for your own specific sites, where those problems are occurring and where they're most prevalent to occur. Are my sites suitable for these protection methods and can I afford them? So again, it all comes down to your personal site and your personal situation. And the best way that you can come through this and grow the healthiest plants, because healthy in, healthier out.